Today I'm talking to the historian and author William Dalrymple, who's introducing his new book, The Golden Road, and it's about India's influence in the ancient world and the extraordinary transformation it left in its trail in a zone that you call the Indosphere.
Correct.
What is the Indosphere?
Well, the Indosphere is a term which is not my own coinage. It has existed for a while out there, but I think it's a very useful term for talking about the way that Indian ideas left India and completely transformed Southeast Asia in a dramatic way that still lingers today. When you go to Indonesia, you often go on the state airline, Garuda. When you arrive in Thailand at Suvarnabhumi Airport, the lands of gold, the old Sanskritic name for Southeast Asia, you might then choose to go to Ayodhya, which is the city just outside Bangkok, the oldest version of Bangkok, named of course after Ayodhya. You might then choose to take a trip to Laos and go and see Kurukshetra. And then you might go for a boat trip on the Mekong, which people don't often realize is just Ma Ganga, Mekong, in a Khmer pronunciation.
Right.
So all this way, far more than I think many Desis realize, there is a massive imprint of Indian civilization, Hindu and Buddhist, on Southeast Asia, in ways that often surprise people. And I go regularly to Angkor Wat, which of course is the largest Hindu temple in the world,
As you said.
larger than any temple in India, which was once the center of the largest Hindu empire in the world, which was the Khmer Empire. People again often think of the Guptas, but in sheer geographical reach, the Khmer was larger. And when you go to Angkor Wat, you often see Indian tourists surprised and baffled to find images of the Ramayana or the Kurukshetra or Krishna and the Gopis on the walls of this. But it shouldn't be a surprise, because it's one of the great achievements of Indian civilization, that it spread these ideas out. And even more remarkably, that it did so entirely peacefully. Contrary to some of the early Indian nationalist ideas in the 1930s that these were Hindu colonies, we know that now not to be true. It wasn't a military conquest, it was something more remarkable. It was an empire of the spirit, an empire of ideas, and Indian ideas, both Buddhist and then later Hindu, profoundly transformed all areas in every direction around India, leaving an imprint that's there today.
I wanted to ask you about the title, because you call it the Golden Road, but it's not really a road, is it? It's, for the most part,
a sea road.
The book talks about sea road, but why did you choose the word Golden Road to describe this book?
There's a number of different reasons. First of all, it's a very simple counter to the Silk Road, because I don't believe the Silk Road existed at all until the 13th century, when the Mongols create a motorway through the middle of Asia, linking the Mediterranean with the South China Sea. Before that, there is much more communication and trade between Roman Egypt and ancient India. There is a massive and forgotten Roman trade from Berenike and Myassormus, which are the Red Sea ports of the Roman Empire, through past Aden, through to Barbaricum, which is where Karachi now is, on the mouth of the Indus. Then Baragaza, which is the great port of Gujarat, leading up to Ujjain and then the Gangetic Plain. And then most important of all, Maziris down in Kerala, now thought to be the village of Putnam, inland from Cochin. And these ports were major centers of Roman trade. And the Indians didn't really want much from the Roman world. They quite liked a little bit of Tuscan wine. And bizarrely, they also liked an interesting Roman fish sauce called garum, and we have many amphorae full of this fermented fish sauce, which seems to have been very popular. It was then in search of replacement gold. After the Roman gold stops on the fall of the Roman Empire, you get this extraordinary pivot eastwards with the Tamil trading guilds. They look for gold in Suvarnabhumi and Suvarnabhumi, probably Sarawak, but certainly that whole region of Indonesia and the Khmer Empire and the Mekong Delta. And it's there in the Jataka stories, it's there in the Ramayana. Sugriva tells Hanuman, kick the floor and gold dust will rise up. And so all this stuff is there, and it's an extraordinary story, how first westwards towards the Roman Empire, then eastwards towards Savarnabhumi, this amazing Indian diaspora that takes place of trade and ideas. And it's powered by the monsoon winds. In ancient times, Indian sailors learned to harness the monsoon winds, which blow, as I'm sure you know, 6 months out of India, and then they reverse and 6 months blow in. So whether you're leaving Kerala going towards the Red Sea, or whether you're leaving Machilipatnam or Nagapatnam on the coast of Tamil Nadu, going down the Malacca Straits to the Mekong Delta and beyond to China, the Indian winds help you by blowing you out and then blowing you in again, which is why.
You've divided the book into several distinct chapters. Why did you make that decision to choose these particular elements of the story?
But it seemed to me that there were 3 ways of grouping it. One was to talk about, first of all, the Buddhist expansion, which takes place from the period of Ashoka onwards. Secondly, the period from the 5th century onwards, when Hinduism and Hindu kingship becomes a massive force in Southeast Asia. Surprisingly late. People are well aware in India of the antiquity of Hinduism and the Vedas. But it isn't really until the 5th century AD that you get these ideas making massive inroads in Southeast Asia. We suddenly find Hindu temples and Buddhist sculpture turning up all over Southeast Asia. And then finally, the final section of my book is the ideas of what ancient India would have called Jyotisa, which is the combined science of maths, astronomy and astrology. And the way that went first to the Arab world, to Baghdad. We have a date, 776. Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta's books are brought by an embassy from the Raja of Sindh to Baghdad, where it's received by the Abbasid Caliph. And then, a couple of generations later, a remarkable translation and reworking of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta takes place under this guy Al-Khwarizmi. His book, the Book of Hindu Calculation, according to completion and balancing, has the nickname, shorter, more accessible, Al-Jabr, which is our word algebra, and then his name, Al-Khwarizmi, is the basis of our word algorithm. And this is the heart of modern science and computing, and yet it comes from this meeting of the Indic world and the Arab world. And the Arab world remembers this, while in the West we call the Indic numbers Arabic numbers because we get them from the Arabs. In the Arab world, they're still known as Hindu numbers.
Really?
Yeah. I think it's only in the 19th century that Europe forgot, because when it first makes it to Europe, and this takes place when Fibonacci is from Pisa. Leonardo of Pisa is his real name. Fibonacci's a nickname. And Fibonacci brings this system back to Italy. He calls it the modus andorem, the Indian method. And so I think it's probably only in the 19th century that we forget this, and it suddenly becomes Arabic numbers.
Another interesting aspect of the book was that Buddhism was not always as austere as we perceive it to be now. Early Buddhists actually believed in yakshis, or have that symbolism incorporated in their structures, and the monasteries were the first banks. So how, that seems contrary to the teachings of the Buddha. How did that happen?
It's not contrary to the teachings of the Buddha, but I think we've come to romanticize Buddhism. Certainly, here in America, where we're speaking, Buddhism, as it appears on Hollywood, is shamans floating, levitating in Marvel movies and with some superpowers. Yeah. Buddhism is a highly worldly religion. It never appealed so much to kings, which is why one of the reasons why it dies out in India, because the Rajputs, who want to hunt, to show their valor in battle, don't like vegetarianism, and they don't like non-violence. But the merchant classes embrace it very much, and it is spread by monks who travel along with merchants. Mm-hmm. The monasteries become caravanserais. We have inscriptions whereby merchants talk about repaying with interest the money lent to them by monks. Often the monasteries are founded on mineral deposits, like
I'll ask you a question about the nature of religion. You've been writing for some years now about the confluence of religion, from the Holy Mountain, the confluence of Islam, Christianity, the Golden Road. You mix
Nine Lives.
Yeah, Nine Lives. I'm coming to that as well. There's all this search for salvation, this desire for enlightenment and detachment from the material. How has that shaped your perspective on a belief system? Are you a person of faith?
I grew up in a very religious household, and although I'm personally not a practicing Christian anymore, I think if you grow up in that world, it molds your perception of the world. And once you understand how central religion is to the outlook of many people, you can never view the world with quite the same spectacles again. So I'm fascinated by religion. So India, so religion and religious history profoundly altered my worldview. But I don't adhere to one particular faith now in the way that my parents did or what my upbringing led me to.
Fair enough. I want to know a little more about the Mosiris papers or papyrus. How did that change the history of the world as we know it?
So the Mosiris papyrus is a papyrus discovered in Egypt 20 years ago, now in Vienna, which gives us hard data on the trade between Rome and Kerala. There's lots of archaeological evidence of objects passing, but hard economic data with figures is very rare in history. And you often see in history books, India has 30% of global GDP during the Gupta period. Now, those figures are often highly questionable because we just don't have modern economic data for past periods. But every so often, a stray document survives. And Egypt is famous for the way that the dryness of the desert has often led to the preservation of all sorts of things, like palm leaf sandals, which in India would disappear in a year in the climate, but somehow with the dryness of the Egyptian desert climate, it survived perfectly. And there's this town called Oxyrhynchus, which I've been to, it's on the edge of the Nile, quarters of the way down the Nile to Luxor. And for some reason, the rubbish dumps of that town, which are on the edge of the town, are in an area so dry and undisturbed that mountains of waste paper have survived there. And it's a total treasure trove. I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of fragments of papyrus we found, but they range from unknown Gospels, Gospel of Thomas. There are early sayings of Jesus which predate those of the Gospels and which survive in Islamic tradition. For example, at Fatwa Sikri we have that phrase, Jesus, Isa, son of Mary, said, life is a bridge, walk over it, do not build your house upon it, or something like that. That's a saying of Jesus which turns up at Oxyrhynchus, never makes it into Christian tradition, but is preserved by Islamic tradition, bizarrely. We have lesbian love poetry of Sappho, we have some of that which has survived at Oxyrhynchus, lost everywhere else. And then in the middle of all this completely random paperwork, some of which is very boring, school exercise books from kids from the first century. In the middle of this is one random shipping invoice of a container from Mosiris in Kerala. This shipping invoice is about the pepper, ivory, cotton, silk, and perfumery materials such as nard and malabathrum, which one entrepreneur shipped from Kerala to Alexandria. And it's a spreadsheet in modern terms. It says the goods, the price, and the amount the Roman state was paying in tariffs. And so it was 30% tariffs. And so the big surprise is that all this stuff is super expensive. No one realized pepper, silk, cotton was being sold for such vast sums in Roman Egypt. These were highly prized. The total container, which had about 200 tons of ivory, which a lot of dead elephants, I'm afraid to say, but 200 tons of ivory and equivalent amounts of pepper.
Mm-hmm.
If it sold for the amount evaluated on the invoice, would have made the importer one of the richest men in Egypt.
But I think about 20 years ago, I bought City of Gins at the W.H. Smith in Edinburgh Airport, in the travel section, because I love books on travel. And one of the reasons is because I'm always curious about perceptions of India, because it's not an easy country to know and love. Yet,
it's an easy country to love, but not an easy country to know.
Not for everyone. You grew up in Scotland. How did your travel writing take you to India, and what keeps you there?
So what brought me was an accident. I actually wanted originally to go and dig Assyrian remains in Iraq, was my original plan of leaving school, and that all went pear-shaped when Saddam Hussein closed the British School of Archaeology, saying it was a nest of British spies. So I literally jumped on a plane with my best friend who was going to be teaching in Dehradun.
Wow.
And that was pure, literally a random ship of the dice. It could have been anywhere. It could have been Malawi, it could have been Vancouver, but it was Missouri, Dehradun. And it took about a month for me to completely fall in love. But I remember thinking by March 1984, this is where I want to spend the rest of my life. This is the most extraordinary place.
How old were you?
80.
Oh.
And I'm now 60. It's the longest year off in history, the longest gap year.
I can relate to that.
But it's, I mean, I could leave tomorrow if I got bored or got more interested in somewhere else. And occasionally, I mean, there's the whole world of Ottoman history in Greece, and occasionally I go on some holiday to some Greek island, and I think it would be nice to spend a couple of years on Rhodes or Crete or Santorini or somewhere. But India keeps pulling me back. For me, as an outsider, I just feel this is extraordinary history that I don't know, and I'm dazzled by it.